He descended slowly and cautiously the steep staircase that had been built more than 300 years before Audrey Hepburn was born. I heard the kitchen door closing behind him. A Holiday Ramble. Now that the reflective years are upon me, I spend considerable time in my study chair, and the avenues and byways of meditation take me into curious but familiar places, inhabited by all kinds of persons, from the immortal to the forgotten. One of the forgotten, except by a few historians and other scholars and me, is Colonel Thomas Hamilton of His Britannic Majesty's Armed Forces. Thomas Hamilton visited the young United States in the early 1830s and went back to England to write a book about our ancestors entitled Men and Manners in America. It seems to me that Americans Have No Manners would have been a title more apt for the Colonel's book, which was first published in 1833, just 1 year after Mrs. Trollope's famous attack on our flaws and foibles and females. It was, as literary historians know, an era of thrust and parry across the Atlantic, and the English had the best of it until Nathaniel Hawthorne slashed back at them with his Our Old Home in the 1860s. Colonel Hamilton was not only more fastidious than the other social critics on either side, he also had the queasiest stomach, and the year he spent among us could well be described as perfectly dreadful. He was repelled by almost everything he saw and heard, from the way Americans drink boiled eggs, to the grammar and the personal habits of President Andrew Jackson, a soldier whose fame is likely to outlive the Colonel's by a good 10,000 years, if there is that much planetary time left. I looked up the Colonel's book in my library the other day and found it buried between Sybil's Garden of Pleasant Beasts and Francis Winthrop Palfrey's The Antietam and Fredericksburg. I've got to get at that shelf one of these days and separate the blood from the fantasy. I began rereading some passages I had indignantly marked in the Hamilton book nearly 20 years ago. My copy of Men and Manners is a later edition published in 1843, and in it Hamilton really let himself go. In telling about the first of a couple of informal calls he made at the President's home, the British officer wrote, "He chews tobacco and kept rolling an enormous quid about in his mouth. He makes sad mistakes, too, in grammar, and asked me about my servitude in the army. The house was dirty and gave you the impression of a large, ill-furnished and ill-kept hotel." Of his second visit, I don't know why he kept going back, the Colonel wrote, "The conversation for the first quarter of an hour was about the state of his bowels, the failure of calomel, the success of salts." The Colonel also had ungallant things to say about American ladies, and about what he regarded as the slovenly carriage of our West Point cadets, and he took a few stabs at our politicians and statesmen. He was appalled by attacks on their character in the public prints. The candidate for Congress or the presidency is broadly asserted to have picked pockets or pocketed silver spoons, the Colonel wrote. I think it was in 1940 that I encountered a repercussion of this statement in, of all places, one of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays. The American poet and philosopher in this essay tells about calling on William Wordsworth in the summer of 1833, or just about the time the Colonel's book was being talked about in England. Here is what Wordsworth told his visitor. "My friend Colonel Hamilton, at the foot of the hill, who was a year in America, assures me that the newspapers are atrocious, and accuse members of Congress of stealing spoons." This constitutes the only piece of 19th century literary research I have ever done, and if I have gone considerably out of my way to get it in, I trust that I shall be forgiven. The great poet's friend and neighbor who lived at the foot of the hill among the trodden ways so long ago happened to be in New York City during the celebration of Evacuation Day more than 120 years ago. This holiday, now as forgotten as the mocking Colonel's satire, celebrated, in profuse and patriotic jollification, the departure of the British Army at the end of the Revolutionary War. Evacuation Day was first celebrated in 1783, and the jubilation began with the official raising of the American flag at the Battery, where once the British colors had boldly flown. This ritual was continued every year until 1847. By that time, the tumult and the shouting had long since died down, and the significance of the occasion was growing dim. Besides, the chill of late November in the city must have taken the edge off an outdoor show of patriotic fervor as the decades rolled by. Furthermore, the flag that had been raised at the Battery for so many years got burned, I don't know how, and this seems to have formed a good excuse for summer soldiers and sunshine patriots to stay home and drink their rum or Madeira in front of the fireplace. Those two beverages, as you shall see, symbolized for Colonel Hamilton labor and the leisure class. The celebration he witnessed was a kind of double feature, and I'll let the Colonel take it from there. On the present occasion, he wrote, it was determined, in addition to the ordinary cause of rejoicing, to get up a pageant of unusual splendor in honor of the late revolution in France. This revolution, I was informed, originated exclusively in the operative class, or workies, as they call themselves, in contradistinction to those who live in better houses, eat better dinners, read novels and poetry, and drink old Madeira instead of Yankee rum. The latter and more enviable class, however, having been taught caution by experience, were generally disposed to consider the present congratulatory celebration as somewhat premature. Finding, however, that it could not be prevented, they prudently gave in and determined to take part in the pageant. Karl Marx was about 15 years old when the Colonel's book came out, and I don't suppose he ever read it. If he had, the term workies might have given him a stroke, and saved the world most of the hell it is going through now. Our dashing colonel, who was the author of a novel called Cyril Thornton, fancied himself as a colorist in prose, and he did noisy justice to the Evacuation Day parade, even dropping in a little Greek, which I mercifully omit from his description. At length the sound of distant music reached the ear, the thunder of the drum, the contralto of the fife, the loud clash of cymbals, and first and furthest heard, the spirit-stirring notes of the trumpet. On they came, a glorious cavalcade making heaven vocal with sound of triumph, and earth beautiful with such coloring as nature never scattered from her pictured urn. And first appeared, gorgeously caparisoned, a gallant steed bestrode by a cavalier, whose high and martial bearing bespoke him the hero of 100 fights. There is a great deal more of this, but let us turn for a moment to another writer's comments on the long-lost holiday. The late George Templeton Strong was one of many old Madeira drinkers, or non-workies, who deplored the passing of Evacuation Day. His diary sorrowfully traces its decline. In 1835, he made this entry, "Glorious Evacuation Day. It allows us to kick up our heels all day at our leisure." Clearly, the jugs were still being brought out, more than 50 years after the first flag-raising ceremony. On November 23rd, 1836, Mr. Strong yelped, "Diabolical outrage. They are not going to give us Evacuation Day. Horrible. We shall have to take it." 6 years later, in 1842, he wrote, "It ain't the Evacuation Day of 10 years ago. Its glories have departed, and nobody thinks about it now." Many a regional holiday, I have no doubt, has bloomed and gone to seed in America, leaving only a faint trace in the pages of old diaries and almanacs. Repudiation Day, for example, was once a time of riotous carryings-on in Frederick, Maryland, and the surrounding county. On November 23rd, 1765, about 8 years before Barbara Fritchie was born, that proud and valiant county was the first to repudiate the British Stamp Act, levied by England under King George III. I don't know how long this great day was wildly celebrated, but it is probable that the hell-raising in its heyday outdid the noise of Evacuation Day farther north, for New York celebrated a departure, but Maryland remembered an injustice. Thanksgiving would have joined these two dead holidays in 1859 if the aldermen of Washington, D.C. had had their way. They voted 7-5 to abandon the day on the ground that it promoted drunkenness and disorder, and had been established by New England people, and the insinuation was, you know what they are. The Stamp Act the Marylanders couldn't abide placed a tax of 1 shilling on every pack of playing cards and 10 shillings on every pair of dice. No American would long tolerate any such tampering with his games of chance or skill. The Repudiation Act roared that all proceedings shall be valid and effectual without the use of stamps. After that, a gentleman was on his own, and what he did with cards or dice was no affair of the royal government. What the American housewife did about tax-free gambling was a private matter, and history has not recorded it. There were surely only a few doxies in the colonies who played cards for profit, and probably none at all addicted to dice. It is different today, and has been ever since the girl of the Golden West cheated the sheriff at poker and won the life of her lover. Once I played cards with my wife at a cafe in France. The proprietor wandered over to our table and asked if he could examine the ace of clubs. I picked it out of my wife's full house, with which she had just beat my 2 pair, and let him see it. He handed it back, bowed, smiled graciously, begged 1,000 pardons, and went away. We looked at the ace of clubs together. It bore a stamp showing that the French tax on playing cards had been paid without rioting in the streets, the deposing of a cabinet, or the firing of a single shot. Par exemple. Here I am, somewhat to my own surprise, in modern France, after starting from New York in 1783. But this is a casual journey, and we shall now visit Ohio momentarily on our way toward the future. They used to celebrate the birthday of President McKinley out there on January 29th, and all the gentlemen of the city burst into bloom that day, each one wearing a red carnation, the late president's favorite flower, in his lapel. Oh, I suppose there were a few followers of William Jennings Bryan whose coats were not in blossom. The day had been forgotten before I reached long trousers, and you could no longer tell a Republican from a Democrat on sight. This brings us to the future, a vast, untrammeled domain where a man's freedom of thought and action is secure, since nobody has yet devised a method of convicting anyone for what he is probably going to think or do. Several undeclared holidays that might well fit into the American years to come have occurred to me during my contemplations. Liability Day, for example, could be set aside, say in January, as the one day of the year during which senators and congressmen would be deprived of immunity and could be sued for libelous remarks made on the floor of the Senate or House. On this day, the kind of senator or congressman that boldly asserts he will be glad to repeat his remarks in private, and practically never does, would be given a chance to prove his courage in full view and hearing of his colleagues, the press, and the visitors' gallery. I doubt whether anything will ever come of this suggestion, unless, of course, it is added to my dossier in the files of the FBI. I don't suppose anything will ever come of Immunity Day either, but I shall outline my concept of it anyway. On this national holiday, all bars and saloons would be open from 12:01 a.m. until midnight, and our present habit of accusing virtually everybody of practically everything would be not only encouraged, but officially condoned. This annual occasion should have a salubrious psychological effect upon the populace by legally releasing inhibitions and repressions. Many persons in our era of fear and hysteria are afraid to say what they think about public figures and national affairs, and have become neurotic victims of ingrown reticence, no longer able to tell discretion from timidity or conviction from guilt. A day of freewheeling criticism would cut down the work of the psychiatrists, thus enabling them to take time out for lunch. On Immunity Day, any citizen could say anything he wanted to about anything or anybody, even Formosa and Chiang Kai-shek, without danger of being hauled to the lockup. This might eliminate, for one day at least, such incidents as the arrest of a lady and gentleman a year or so ago for discussing the Chinese situation in a public restaurant in Houston, Texas. Fact Day, to be celebrated on June 21st, a week after Flag Day, should be a day on which only the proved is tolerated, but the truth must in every instance be constructive and favorable to those who are criticized. If you know anything good about anybody, it should be generously spoken on Fact Day, without a sniff, leer, wink, or raised eyebrow. Fact Day speakers at rallies or banquets or open-air meetings should attempt to revive in the minds of their listeners the old, abandoned American assumption of innocence, pointing out that guilt is not a matter of guesswork or conjecture, but of proof. National Misgiving Day, to be held on the last Thursday of October, a month before Thanksgiving Day, could be the occasion for the assembling of American families for the purpose of pooling and enunciating their accumulated doubts, suspicions, and apprehensions, with a view to throwing out, in sober family council, any that may have grown out of mistaken identity, bad telephone connections, hearsay, conclusion jumping, change of life, hyperthyroidism, cussedness, political ambition, malice, animosity, pride, envy, anger, or temporary or permanent loss of mind, grip, or bearings. Misgivings that turn out to be well-founded should be carefully examined and appraised by the elder and soberer members of households before they are telephoned to the FBI, told to the corner druggist, or passed on to United States senators. Misgiving Day would give the faltering American family a nationally sponsored reason to reassemble and to get to know each other better. Emergence Day, which could be coincidental with Groundhog Day, would direct nationwide attention to persons who have been falsely accused of undermining or overthrowing, and have holed up in their houses or apartments with the blinds pulled down, the doors locked, and the telephone disconnected. If they have been wrongfully shadowed or tailed, and on emerging see their shadow or tail, they shall have the right and duty to point out such shadow or tail to the constabulary or other duly constituted authorities, who must then put a shadow on the tail or a tail on the shadow and trace it to its lair or liar. Games for Emergence Day parties instantly suggest themselves, but I shall leave the working out of the rules for such games to persons better qualified for merriment than I am. Nobody would be arrested on Emergence Day for anything he had not done or for anything he had once thought. It is not my intention to urge the reinstatement of Evacuation Day as an annual occasion for fun and games or rum and Madeira in New York City, since I believe that New Yorkers can get along on the 4th of July in their celebration of the defeat of the British. The old lost holiday has, however, given me an idea for Evaluation Day. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI properly and soundly object to the evaluation of dossiers on suspected persons by the police or other investigatory organizations, but this has left many of us with what might be called moist qualms. These come from too much worry about who is going to do the evaluating, and we who are susceptible to the galloping jumps or the chattering jitters sometimes have nightmares about going through life completely unevaluated. In my own anxiety dream, I am caught with a Russian passport while wearing only the top of my pajamas, usually in the lobby of the Hotel Sheraton Astor. Just what will take place on Evaluation Day I have not yet worked out in my mind, and I think the arrangements should probably be left to some federal commission appointed for the purpose. Don't ask me who is going to evaluate the evaluators. I don't know. I am just a righty. After this piece appeared in the New Yorker in 1955, the late Henry Pratt Fairchild, professor emeritus of sociology at New York University, wrote the editors as follows. James Thurber, in A Holiday Ramble, makes one erroneously optimistic statement. He says, "This brings us to the future, a vast, untrammeled domain where a man's freedom of thought and action is secure, since nobody has yet devised a method of convicting anyone for what he is probably going to think or do. It may be that nobody has devised such a method, but our legislators in Washington act as if they had. The Internal Security Act of 1950, commonly referred to as the McCarran Act, provides in Section 104, A, that during an emergency, the Attorney General or his representative is authorized to issue 1, a warrant for the apprehension of each person as to whom there is reasonable ground to believe that such person probably will engage in or probably will conspire with others to engage in acts of espionage or sabotage, and that such persons are to be confined in places of detention. Mr. Thurber is not to be blamed. He is probably one of the 99 and 44/100% of the population who do not know that we have such a law. They should. There's something out there. Loch Ness, for the past quarter of a century one of the most famous places on Earth, is a long, narrow slash of deep water cutting diagonally across Inverness-shire in the historic West Highlands of Scotland. Its somber depths and rugged banks are rich in lore and legend, as befits a former part of the great medieval domain of Macbeth, and the dark dwelling in this century of the world's most publicized and controversial aquatic creature, the so-called Loch Ness Monster, since 1933 familiarly known to millions as Nessie. After 24 years, the fabulous riddle of the loch still remains unsolved, still attracts thousands of sightseers annually, fascinates investigators, bemuses scientists, inspires in most of its Scottish hosts a quiet pride of possession, but in others a dour embarrassment. The monster has been seen again this year, the first time on March 11th, by a police constable and a schoolmaster, whose experience was reported in the staid pages of the Times of London, which had recognized the possible existence of Nessie in December 1933, 7 months after its debut in the picturesque loch-laced region of heath and heather, burn and glen and strath, peat and barley, castle ruins, and ancient forts that once guarded the great glen. Loch Ness is also associated with Bruce, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and the ships of Cromwell. Johnson and Boswell stopped there on their way to the Hebrides, and Robert Burns visited the loch and described it in verse. Since the cry "There's something out there" was first raised on the loch side in the troubled spring of 1933, the thing in the loch has bobbed up month after month, except for a few longer wartime intervals, in the water and in the newspapers and periodicals of 6 continents. It has been written about seriously, sensationally, and skeptically, facetiously, indignantly, and even angrily. Cartoonists of many countries have used it for the subject of everything from sardonic, silly season whimsy to savage political satire. Although Nessie has not been and may never be received into the scientific category of natural history, to quote one cautious London zoologist, it has taken a permanent and conspicuous place in the long gallery of weird mysteries and wild alarms that extends from the beast of Revelation to the flying saucers of the atomic era, and includes such ancient and fantastic British exhibits as the questing beast of the Arthurian legends, whose noise was like unto the questing of 30 couple of hounds, and the bunyip of Australia, reputed to seize and carry off wicked adults and incorrigible children. In our time, only Banjakris, the abominable snowman of Asia, approaches the grotesque stature of Nessie's fame, but the Himalayan mountain monster's scrapbook of press clippings is by no means so thick or varied, even though it was first sighted by Western eyes as long ago as 1899, 34 years before Nessie made its advent in the loch. It became a contemporary of Nessie when it was seen by the Everest expedition of 1936. 1,400 years earlier than Nessie, or 5 centuries before Shakespeare's gory Thane of Glamis and Cawdor murdered his way to royal power, there had been a wondrous tale of some enormous and mysterious animal in the complicated waters of the loch, whose tributaries include 8 rivers and 40 brooks. One Adam Nan, in his Latin biography of St. Columba, abbot of Iona, related how that holy man, encountering the dreadful creature about to seize a Pict, raised his hand and commanded, "Touch not that man, begone at once," whereupon it bewent, sinking tamely to its secret lair at the bottom of the river Ness. It appears likely that this ancient legend was unknown to the couple who, on April 14, 1933, while driving on the north shore of Ness, were attracted by a violent commotion in the loch, and watched a long, dark, humped body travel through the water at high speed, and then suddenly dive, leaving in its wake a furious swirl of foam upon the surface. On that now celebrated April day, John Mackay, proprietor of the Drumnadrochit Hotel, was driving his wife home from Inverness on the motor road that runs for 30 miles along the northern bank, when Mrs. Mackay got what is generally conceded to be the first look at the great phenomenon. Others, to be sure, claim to have been first witness, including the distinguished Sir Compton Mackenzie, who insisted to me in Edinburgh in 1955 that he had glimpsed the thing on April 13th. The author of Sinister Street and more than 80 other books, now in his 70s, staunchly contends, against an imposing weight of contradictory evidence, that what he and the Mackays saw was only a large, wounded gray seal. A fortnight after their experience, the Mackays related what they had seen to their old friend Alexander Campbell, water bailiff of Fort Augustus, and local correspondent of the Inverness Courier. It was Mr. Campbell who dubbed the creature the Loch Ness Monster in his story for the Courier. Then on May 11th, 1933, Alexander Shaw and his son Alistair, standing in front of their house 150 feet above the water on the south shore, saw something, again long and dark and humped, 500 yards out, heading toward Urquhart Bay. A dependable count is impossible to obtain, but the monster was reported at least 33 times in 1933, and more than twice as often the following year, by which time a regular coach service was running tourists out from Inverness. Thousands of motor cars from London, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and Edinburgh drove slowly along both banks, and hundreds of excited picnickers from everywhere thronged the banks in good weather. Trees had been cut down and underbrush cleared away in the building of new motor roads, and long areas of the loch once screened from view were now visible. During Nessie's heyday, the 6 years preceding the Second World War, the crowded hotels and shops of Loch Ness flourished mightily. Every second cottage was turned into a tea shop, hotels were full up from Whitsuntide until late October, bed and breakfast signs appeared on hundreds of homes, and the loch was restlessly spangled with motor launches, private yachts, rowboats, and canoes. By 1936, there was a heavy tangle of traffic from dawn to dusk along the more than 60 miles of new motor roads that encircle the loch. Newspapermen and photographers were assigned to the story singly and in pairs and in groups by the newspapers of the British Isles and the continent. Millions of words were printed, and the literature of the Loch Ness Monster is now vast, unorganized, and bewildering. It takes 10 hours to read through the Daily Mail's monster clippings. Scores of pamphlets on the subject appeared, and a number of books, including a 221-page volume, The Loch Ness Monster, 1934, by the late Lieutenant Commander R.T. Gould, R.N., and The Rival Monster, a 1952 satire by the doubting Sir Compton, in which a flying saucer kills the monster. The latest book, More Than a Legend, by Constance White, was published only last April. The author is the wife of the manager of the Caledonian Canal, whose 17 locks and the River Ness give the monster's lair access to firths and the open sea at the northeast end. 20 years ago, while leisurely touring the British Isles with my wife, I drove up one July evening to a small inn on the loch side. I had not given the monster story any study or much thought. American newspapers, wary of tall tales since the era of Paul Bunyan and the years of P.T. Barnum, had approached the story lightly, somewhat in the manner of colored postcards by Tuck in Britain, which showed anglers pulling gigantic fish and dragons out of the loch. The New York Herald Tribune, in an editorial in 1933, had quickly dismissed the whole business as a tourist trap. 7 years later, Goebbels devoted a double page in the Hamburger Illustrierte to Nessie, exposing it as a myth, a summer season invention of hotels and tourist agencies. He ignored 2 skillfully faked photographs of the captured monster, which had been published in one of his own Berlin papers in 1934, one of them depicting Nessie being hauled out of the loch, and the other showing it on public exhibition in Edinburgh. In 1940, Mussolini's paper, Popola d'Italia, declared the monster had been destroyed by a direct hit during the intensified bombing of Britain. At about the same time, a Tokyo journal, unaware of this bravura boast, informed its readers that the thing was prowling the very heath on which Macbeth had encountered the weird sisters. My wife and I had driven some 10 miles of one bank without seeing anything unusual in the water. It was still and warm when we arrived at the inn. 2 bagpipers were playing Scottish airs near the water's edge. That night I ventured to suggest to the innkeeper that the monster might have been nothing more than a pair of itinerant musicians who had floundered into the water, bagpipes and all. My host viewed my levity with polite resentment. "There's something out there, you know," he said quietly, but with unmistakable conviction. He had never seen the monster himself, but he knew a number of persons who had, one of them a nun, 2 of them priests. These 3 had taken their experiences calmly, but had declined to be interviewed by journalists. I was later to learn that a number of other eyewitnesses, mainly residents of Inverness-shire, carefully avoided publicity about what they had seen. The next morning, up early, we drove almost all the way around the Loch Ness banks, but again saw nothing but boats on the brooding water. The loch itself oppresses me as much as it did when I first saw it 20 years ago, wrote the Daily Mail's Percy Cater in 1953. 2 decades earlier, he had been the first Fleet Street reporter on the scene. It remains as enigmatic as the face of Mona Lisa. Its surface, suggestive of its sinister deeps, is as forbidding as anything I know. In this harsh landscape, it is easy to think of strange goings-on in the loch. Ness, one of Scotland's many lochs, is the largest body of fresh water in the British Isles, 24 miles long, nearly 2 miles across at its widest, with a maximum depth of 754 feet. It is estimated to contain 263 billion cubic feet of water, or 3 times as much as romantic Loch Lomond. In shape, it somewhat resembles Bermuda, from St. George's to the tip of Somerset, and its area is not a great deal smaller. Situated in the foothills of the Grampians, it is alternately primitive and populated, a holiday resort of villages and hotels and cottages, with long, high stretches of green hills that seem wild and remote from civilization. The loch's surface, more than 50 feet above sea level, never freezes over. It changes moods with the weather, from the tranquil blue of the Mediterranean to a dark imitation of the sea. Legend holds that there are vast subterranean caves far below the surface, but divers have never verified this. Not many have been able to descend very far, and one, seeking to recover the jewels worn by a woman drowned in the loch, is said to have returned hastily to the surface, gibbering of strange sights and menacing creatures. The loch teems with salmon, trout, eels, and many another living thing. Superstition has also stocked it with kelpies, water beasts out of Gaelic myth, equine in form, reputed to seize and drown swimmers. The loch, according to another legend, never gives up its dead, and despite police records of recovered bodies, this old belief will not die. Controversy, when I returned to Scotland in 1955, was as strong as ever, and 2 basic and opposed theories separated the believers from the scoffers. On the one hand, multiple witnesses, and on the other, mass hallucination. There was also a faction of optical illusionists who based their hypothesis on the strange tricks played upon the eye by the changing moods, the shifting lights and shadows, and the deceptive distances of the loch. Hoax and hysteria had early begun raising their mischievous heads. One day in 1934, the veritable tracks of a hippopotamus were discovered on one bank near the water's edge. Casts of them were hastily made and shipped to the British Museum. They all turned out to be of the same 4-toed foot, plainly a hunter's trophy that had fallen into the hands of some practical joker. Now and then, strange contraptions were secretly slipped into the loch at night, homemade monsters built of logs or wooden chairs linked to miscellaneous junk with rope or wire. Weird amphibians, spawned in fears and fancies, prowled the loch side at night, one of them resembling an enormous horse with eyes as bright as car headlights. One morning, the skeletal remnants of a voracious beast's midnight meal were found on the shore, but they proved to be butcher shop bones arranged by a waggish human hand. Despite the exposure of hoaxes, there was a growing belief among crofters and other lochsiders that the monster was in fact an amphibian, with a habit of hunting the woods at night. Mrs. White flatly states her conviction that An Nisak, as she calls Nessie, does come out of the water and cross the road. She cites the experience of a motorcyclist named Grant, a man of steady nerves and good reputation, who almost bumped into the creature on a moonlit night in January 1934 as it crossed the road in 2 bounds and plunged into the water. He called it an unknown hybrid, 15 to 20 feet long. 6 months earlier, a Mr. and Mrs. Spicer had had a similar encounter in early daylight with a thing that also crossed the road in front of their car, its long neck like an elephant's trunk, undulating and forming several arches. Their account had been accepted as bona fide by Commander Gould. Unbelievers promptly named this animal a gray seal, a sea lion, or a walrus, but Grant and the Spicers vehemently insist that what they saw was of loathsome texture and unique slimy appearance, with a small head and curious oval eyes, and their description conforms to that of an English engineer who, about the same period, had watched an enormous hybrid in the water near the shore at dawn. All sorts of speculations and suppositions have been advanced by those who refuse to believe in an unknown beast. The creature is Sir Compton's amphibious gray seal, or a school of playful salmon, two of the most persistent assumptions, a shark, a killer whale, a giant squid, a diving crested grebe or a green cormorant, an otter with a fish in its mouth, a ribbon fish, a salamander, a romping of boisterous porpoises, a flight of wild geese skimming the loch's surface, even a prehistoric plesiosaurus, which had survived the Mesozoic age. This was once a long creature with 4 short legs that could be used for paddles in swimming. Believers in the survival of outsized prehistoric monsters point to a gigantic bat bird, closely resembling a pterodactyl, which explorer Ivan Sanderson beheld a few years ago, swooping above an African river, showing the long, gleaming teeth of its massive lower jaw. An oldster claimed that the monster was a German airship that had plunged into the loch in 1918 and kept rising and sinking. One group of theorists stuck to the notion of a long, hollow tree trunk inhabited by underwater creatures which surfaced when they left it and submerged when they returned from food forays. Others mentioned mirages or the possibility of phenomena caused by subterranean gases, blasting, rock faults, and earth tremors. In November 1950, the Portsmouth Naval Station's School of Torpedoes and Mines exploded the myth with pontifical authority by revealing that a chain of mines had been planted in the loch during the First World War. This pronouncement was soon forgotten with most of the other suggestions, including one about a small boy's pet crocodile which had escaped into the loch many years before. Old wives' tales and those of ancient mariners recalled unexplained disturbances in Ness and other lochs in 1872, 1893, 1903, and 1923. One candidate for the title of Loch Ness Monster, which has been curiously neglected, is the oarfish, Regalicus glesni. It reaches a length of from 20 to 30 feet, can live longer than 20 years, is known to swim occasionally on the surface, and when it swims, it throws its elongated body into great serpentine curves. When the oarfish is excited, it raises a crest, or mane, consisting of the anterior rays of its long dorsal fin. It is noteworthy that at least 14 separate reports have described the loch creature as having a mane like a horse's. A few years ago, an alleged oarfish 13 feet long was pulled out of nearby Loch Finn. Against the oar's validity as the true monster are its narrowness of body, its silvery color, and the coral redness of its fins. But the primary argument against the oarfish is its supposed allergy to fresh water. A conger eel can live in either salt or fresh or brackish water, but zoologists doubt that the oar has such a power of accommodation, though none has adduced positive proof. The assumption that Nessie was loch-born is supported by the admitted difficulty any large creature would have in reaching Loch Ness from the open sea. Commander Gould, however, defended the possibility after a careful study of the River Ness, which leads to Bewley Firth. He figured that a sea creature the size of Nessie could manage the passage at night and unseen when the water is in spate in January or February. It was his respected opinion that brought about Nessie's first appearance in the Times of London. Just 5 years ago, a wake monster was added to the lively conjectures of conclusion jumpers. This ingenious conception of Nessie grew out of the loch's most terrible disaster, the tragic destruction of John Rhodes Cobb's celebrated jet-propelled powerboat Crusader, which was streaking at more than 200 miles an hour over a measured mile on September 29, 1952, seeking a new world's record, when it struck a wave band set up by another boat, nose-dived sharply, and was literally blown to bits like an exploding bomb. Such wave bands, long and narrow, expire harmlessly on beaches, but are reactivated when trapped between sheer cliffs at water's edge on either bank, as is often the case in nests, and may lash back and forth in antic force for nearly half an hour after the passage of a vessel. The wake monster is worthy of mention as an outstanding instance of the continuing reluctance of skeptics to admit that the thing in the loch is alive. We come now in this court of lore to the witnesses for the defense of a living Nessie, those orthodox believers, impressively numerous, whose consistent testimony over a period of 24 years forms the classic description of Nessie as something strange, enormous, and alive, elongated from 20 to 50 feet, capable of sinuous, hump-producing behavior, and a surface speed of 20 knots or more. Given to unpredictable appearances and reappearances, usually in still, warm weather, and sudden submergings which leave in its wake a foaming agitation. Well over 1,000 persons, according to the Daily Mail, have watched or glimpsed the wonder in the water, whose recorded appearances have now reached a total of more than 300. It has been seen for less than a minute by some observers, for nearly an hour by others, lolling on the surface occasionally or sunbathing, but for the most part undulating rapidly over the surface of the loch in short spurts, or in cavortings that keep it visible for several hundred yards. Its disappearances have usually been followed by at least one reemergence. Commander Gould, arriving at his own hypothetical measurements by averaging those of 58 witnesses he interviewed in 1933 and 1934, figured that Nessie is about 45 feet long. The central part of the body he estimated to be 20 feet in length, with an active 10-foot tail, and a 15-foot snake-like neck surmounted by a head resembling that of a sheep or a small horse or cow. Its main body has often been described as being like an upturned rowing boat. In Britain, such a boat is often 15 feet long. Nessie is possessed of inviolable mutism, a phrase invented by the late William Bolitho to describe the vocal silence of Harpo Marx. No witness has ever heard it make any sound except that of the swirling waters. In this it conforms to the nature of its famous cousin, the sea serpent. The seal, by the way, is a notorious barker, and the porpoise a celebrated chatterbox. Let us now consider the testimony of 3 separate eyewitnesses notable for soundness, competence, and reliability. The first of them, an experienced skipper, in the sturdy tradition of Maysfield's dirty British coaster with a salt-caked smokestack, Captain William Brodie of Leith, master of the steam tug Arrow. This tug was plying the loch on August 30th, 1938, when its captain and its crew, except for one fireman, sighted Nessie. Captain Brodie thereupon entered the following in his log. Sighted Loch Ness monster while close inshore about 2.5 miles east of Castle Urquhart at 4:40 p.m. In sight again for half a minute, 4:50 p.m. Later, in an interview, Captain Brodie said that on its second appearance, the monster traveled at great speed near the tug, displaying several humps as against the 1 or 2 he had observed first. It could not have been a whale, he said, or any other common creature, and his crew agreed. I did not believe in the monster and had not been looking for it, Captain Brodie insisted. There can be no doubt of the monster's existence. We come next to Mr. Ewan Fraser, former caretaker of Urquhart Castle. Mr. Fraser, 73 years old, but with the keen vision of the lifetime Lochside resident, had spotted the monster in July 1934, and did not see it again until August 14, 1954. This time he quickly called his neighbor, Maggie MacDonald, and her description of the monster, the standard one, coincided with his. At this very moment, it later transpired, the same manifestation had been watched by a Mackenzie and a McLean, the latter having viewed it through a telescope.